In a small town, a bell rang at night without a bell ringer. Always the same. Always 13 strikes. At first, people were afraid. Then they grew used to it. But then they noticed something strange. The bell only rang when no one disappeared, no one fell ill, and no rules were broken. It did not ring for sins or warnings. It rang when everything was perfectly still. Years later, beneath the tower, a hidden chamber was discovered with chains and the pastor's journals, describing how the sound could correct people if they listened long enough. But the worst part was not what he did. The worst part was that the bell kept ringing after the pastor died, after the chamber was sealed, after the town declared itself cleansed. And then it became clear, it no longer punished anyone. It was simply counting those who had already learned to be silent. The bell began ringing before the snow finished falling. It cut through the night like a dull blade, heavy and patient, each strike separated by the same long breath of silence, as if the tower itself were counting. The sound did not rush or waver. It arrived whole, deliberate, pressing against walls, roofs, and sleeping bodies with equal indifference. Frost bloomed across windows as the vibrations crept through stone and timber, and people woke with the sensation that something had already been decided for them. The town lay folded into the dark hills of Saxony, small enough that every sound carried history with it. Dogs whimpered and went quiet. Horses shifted in their stalls, hooves scraping once, then stillness. The bell rang 13 times, always 13, no more and no less. Each strike identical to the last, like a sentence repeated until meaning dissolved into fear. When the final echo faded, it left behind a silence that felt thicker than snow, a silence that pressed into ears and lungs and refused to lift. By instinct more than courage, a few men wrapped themselves in coats and stepped into the square. Snow clung to their boots, muffling movement, making the world feel submerged. The bell tower loomed above them, its stone dark with moisture, its narrow windows blind and unlit. No rope swayed inside. No shadow moved behind the slats. The bell hung perfectly still, yet the air still trembled faintly, as if remembering the sound. By morning, the town spoke in lowered voices. People compared the moment they had woken, the way their hearts had already been racing before they understood why. Every account matched too closely to be coincidence. 13 strikes. The same measured pause. The same sense that the sound had not come from above, but from somewhere inside the body itself. The pastor listened with calm attention, fingers folded, eyes steady, and reminded them that winter carried strange acoustics, that cold stone played tricks on sound, that faith required discipline against fear. Yet small details refused to settle. The bell had not rung for any feast or warning. The air had been windless. The rope showed no sign of movement, no frost disturbed by friction. And beneath the reassurances lingered older memories, half-buried stories of past winters when sickness crept through homes without leaving marks, when certain parishioners began screaming during prayer, claiming the sound of the bell followed them even into sleep. That night the snow fell again, slower this time, thicker, as if insulating the town from the sky. Windows were shuttered early. Candles burned longer than usual. People lay awake listening not for sound, but for the space where sound would appear. When the bell rang again, unchanged, patient, and exact, something shifted beneath the fear. It was no longer surprise that tightened their chests, but recognition. The tower was not announcing something that had happened. It was counting something that had begun. By daylight the bell was mute, innocent, hanging above the square like a relic of order that had outlived its purpose. Sunlight softened the stone of the tower, revealing hairline cracks and water stains that looked harmless under a clear sky. Children crossed the square without glancing up. Merchants unloaded carts. Smoke rose straight from chimneys, thin and obedient. In the morning, the bell appeared exactly as it had for generations, fixed in place, heavy and unquestioned, as though the night had been a shared hallucination the town would soon discipline itself into forgetting. But sound carried memory in a town this small, and memory clung the way damp clung to cellar walls. Everyone remembered when the ringing first began, even if no one agreed on the precise moment. It was always described in relation to other misfortunes, as if the mind needed anchors to make sense of it. It came after the bad winter, the one that split barrels and killed fruit trees down to the roots. It came after the sickness among the livestock, when cows stiffened overnight and pigs refused feed, their eyes clouded and unresponsive. It came after whispers started circling the church benches, rumors of people shaking during prayer, collapsing without wounds, waking convinced something had been placed inside them. During the day, these stories were spoken carefully, trimmed of excess, stripped of emotion. At night, they grew teeth. The bell tower cast a long shadow across the square even at noon, and some swore it leaned farther than before, though no measurement confirmed it. Stone did not move. Bronze did not decide. That was what the pastor reminded them of, patiently and often. The bell was metal shaped by human hands, hung by rope and beam, governed by gravity and intent. There was nothing inside it that could want. Yet the pastor began locking the tower at dusk. At first it passed without comment. Winters bred caution, and keys were symbols of stewardship. The pastor had always been meticulous, his habits precise to the point of ritual. He kept the church spotless, the records immaculate, the schedules exact. When he slipped the iron key into his coat pocket and fastened it closed, it seemed merely another layer of order imposed on a world that had recently proven unreliable. The problem was not the locking. It was that the keys never left him. People noticed because people always notice patterns before they understand them. The pastor no longer lingered in the square after evening prayers. He did not accept invitations that would keep him out past sunset. When he walked, his hand rested unconsciously against his chest, fingers curved around the weight of metal beneath wool. His sermons grew longer, more structured, heavy with repetition. Certain words surfaced again and again, arranged like steps in a stair that led nowhere visible but demanded ascent all the same. The tower interior remained off-limits. Children who once dared each other to climb the narrow stairs found the door sealed. Men who offered to inspect the bell mechanism were thanked and dismissed. There was no need, they were told. The bell worked as it always had. By day, this was demonstrably true. The rope hung slack. The beam showed no new wear. Dust lay undisturbed on the stone steps. The bell did not sway even when strong hands pushed against the tower walls, testing for resonance. It remained an object, nothing more. And yet the nights continued. 13 strikes, always 13, arriving with such consistency that some began to wake seconds before the first blow, hearts already racing as if summoned in advance. The sound did not echo outward so much as press inward, flattening itself against flesh and bone. It did not belong to the air. It belonged to the body. Those who tried to count the seconds between strikes found the intervals identical, not to the beat of a clock, but to something slower, something biological, something that resisted measurement. Sleep became unreliable. Dreams thickened, repeating themselves with slight variations. People dreamed of enclosed spaces, of walls that narrowed incrementally, of sounds that grew clearer the longer one stayed still. They woke with jaws clenched and tongues numb, convinced they had been holding their breath for far too long. In the morning, faces looked older, drawn tight around the eyes. No one mentioned the shared imagery. That would have made it real. The pastor listened to these concerns with the same steady patience he brought to all matters. He encouraged fasting, structure, repetition. He reminded them that fear thrived on excess sensation and that discipline was its cure. He recommended silence before sleep. He suggested prayers timed to breathing. He proposed routines that flattened the day into manageable segments. People followed these instructions because following them felt like action, and action felt like control. What unsettled them was how closely the night's ringing began to align with the pastor's guidance. The bell rang only after days of extended confession. It rang only when certain households had attended evening prayer. It rang on nights when the air was so still that even leaves refused to move, when the town seemed sealed under glass. Each occurrence left behind not panic, but a strange clarity, as if something had been completed. Absences began quietly. A woman sent to stay with relatives. A man reassigned to work beyond the hills. A boy removed from service and spoken of no further. These explanations were accepted because they were familiar shapes, because small towns survived on the ability to not look too closely. But the timing was difficult to ignore. Each disappearance was followed by the ringing, precise and unhurried, as though marking an entry in a ledger only the tower could see. By daylight, the square returned to its routines. Snow melted into gutters. Bells from distant towns carried faintly on the wind, ordinary and harmless. The tower stood unchanged, its bell suspended in perfect balance. Yet the memory of the sound lingered like pressure behind the eyes, and the knowledge settled slowly, unwilling to be named. The bell did not announce events. It responded to them. And whatever it responded to was still happening, quietly, beneath the appearance of order. The second year did not arrive with shock, but with refinement. Fear lost its edges and became procedural, something that could be anticipated, arranged around, prepared for. The bell no longer startled the town. It confirmed what many already suspected but had learned not to articulate. Patterns emerged not because anyone sought them, but because repetition carved them into memory with the patience of water against stone. The ringing followed confession days with increasing reliability. When the church benches were filled and the air inside grew thick with breath and candle smoke, when heads bowed in synchronized submission and the floorboards absorbed the collective weight of guilt, the bell would answer that evening. Not during the prayers themselves, not while the pastor's voice shaped the hour, but later, when the town had dispersed and doors were barred. The sound arrived after completion, never interruption, as though responding to a signal already given. Certain names began appearing more often on the church rolls. They were not marked differently, not circled or emphasized, but familiarity made them visible. These were the people spoken of carefully, with lowered voices and narrowed eyes. The ones who woke screaming, who stiffened during hymns, whose bodies betrayed them with shaking hands or sudden collapses. The town had always tolerated oddness in measured doses, but now oddness felt like a contagion, something that demanded attention before it spread. The pastor's record-keeping grew more meticulous. Attendance was logged with unwavering precision. Absences were noted and addressed quickly. Private sessions extended late into the afternoon, sometimes beyond sunset, and afterward the tower key rested heavy in his coat. Those who emerged from these sessions often appeared lighter, emptied, their movements slower and more deliberate, as if something had been carefully removed. Others did not emerge at all, and their absence was explained before questions could take shape. They were sent away, the town was told, to relatives who lived beyond the hills, to monasteries equipped to handle such afflictions, to places better suited for correction and care. These explanations worked because they followed familiar routes, paths already etched into the social map. No one admitted how rarely letters arrived from these destinations, how often the names quietly stopped being spoken altogether. The nights grew more selective. The bell rang only when the wind was dead, when the air lay heavy and unmoving over the square. Leaves froze in place. Smoke rose straight and thin from chimneys, unbent by current. On those nights, the smell of damp wood and iron seeped into homes, carried not by motion but by presence, as though the scent had always been there and only now allowed itself to be noticed. It crept into bedding, into clothing, into lungs, leaving behind a faint metallic taste that lingered until morning. Each ringing followed a disappearance with unsettling punctuality. Never before, never delayed. 13 strikes, each separated by the same deliberate pause, long enough for dread to collect but not dissipate. People found themselves counting without intention, breath hitching in anticipation of the next blow. The rhythm did not accelerate or falter. It did not express emotion. It enacted a process. Those left behind adjusted. They learned to identify the days that would lead to sound. They avoided eye contact during confession. They spoke less. Movements became economical, controlled. Children were kept indoors after dusk. Windows were shuttered early, not to block the sound, but to prevent the sensation of being observed. Sleep was treated as a fragile resource, guarded and rationed. Beneath this surface compliance, something else took root. A recognition that the bell was no longer simply reacting to behavior, but shaping it. People began altering routines not to avoid wrongdoing, but to avoid attention. Guilt became dangerous not because of divine judgment, but because it marked one for notice. Silence was no longer virtue. It was camouflage. The pastor's presence grew heavier. He aged rapidly in ways that defied the calendar. His face sharpened, cheeks hollowing, eyes sinking deeper into shadow. He spoke often of endurance, of repetition as a cleansing force. He praised those who demonstrated control, who resisted impulse, who learned to exist without excess sensation. His sermons described the body as an instrument prone to disobedience, requiring calibration through discipline and restraint. The tower itself began to feel altered, though no visible change could be named. The stones seemed darker, perpetually damp even in dry weather. Moss crept higher along its base. Birds avoided its upper ledges. The interior remained sealed, its narrow stairs untraveled, dust undisturbed. Yet some swore they could feel vibration beneath their feet when passing too close at night, a low resonance that did not travel outward but downward, into the ground itself. Dreams grew more uniform. People dreamed of counting without numbers, of waiting without movement, of sounds that only existed if one remained perfectly still. They woke exhausted, convinced they had been awake all night, even when sleep had technically occurred. Some found scratches on their arms, marks they could not recall making. Others complained of pressure in their ears, as if exposed to a sound just beyond hearing. No one confronted the pastor directly. Authority in the town functioned not through force, but through shared denial. To question him openly would require naming the pattern, and naming it would collapse the fragile structure that kept daily life intact. Instead, people adjusted further, compressing themselves into smaller versions, reducing unpredictability, aligning behavior with whatever logic the bell seemed to follow. The disappearances continued, spaced with unsettling regularity. Each one left behind a vacuum that was quickly filled with rational explanation and ritualized mourning. But the ringing that followed did not allow for grief. It imposed closure with mechanical precision. Once the 13th strike faded, the event was sealed, placed beyond discussion, absorbed into the town's growing archive of resolved anomalies. By the end of the second year, the bell no longer needed to surprise. It had taught the town how to anticipate. Fear had matured into expectation, and expectation into obedience. Whatever the bell was responding to, whatever process it marked, was now embedded deeply enough that resistance felt not only futile, but incorrect. The sound had become a measure of completion, and with each disappearance, the town felt itself becoming quieter, cleaner, and more precisely arranged, as though something unseen were steadily refining it toward a final, unspoken standard. The truth surfaced quietly, without ceremony, the way rot reveals itself only after the structure has already weakened. The pastor was found in his bed just before dawn, hands clenched against his chest, spine arched unnaturally, face twisted into an expression that suggested attention rather than pain. His mouth was open, not in a cry, but in the shape of listening, as though some final sound had reached him that no one else could hear. There were no marks on his body, no sign of struggle. He had simply stopped, frozen mid-reception. The town reacted with practiced restraint. Death was familiar. It could be folded into routine, scheduled, ritualized. The pastor was washed, dressed, and laid out beneath the same roof where he had preached endurance and silence. Candles burned. Heads bowed. No one spoke of the bell during the vigil, though many noticed the way the tower loomed darker than usual through the church windows, its presence pressing inward as if observing the proceedings. It was necessity, not curiosity, that led to the discovery beneath the tower. With the pastor gone, responsibility transferred to practical hands. Records needed sorting. Keys needed accounting. The tower, long sealed, required inspection if only to confirm that nothing within posed danger. When workers pried loose the door at the base, the air that escaped carried a scent unlike anything above ground, a mixture of damp stone, iron, and something faintly sweet, preserved too carefully to be accidental. Behind a section of wall sealed with mortar still pale against older stone, they found the chamber. It was narrow, carved directly into the earth beneath the tower, its ceiling low enough to force the body into submission. Iron restraints were bolted into the walls at precise intervals, corroded but intact, positioned at heights that suggested prolonged suspension rather than confinement. The stone bore darkened streaks that ran downward in uneven paths, dried residue layered over time, absorbed into the surface until it could not be scraped away. The floor sloped subtly toward a central depression where moisture collected, stagnant and thick. The space did not feel abandoned. It felt concluded. Stacked along the far wall were journals, wrapped carefully in cloth, arranged by size and wear. The pages inside were dense with writing, disciplined and exact, lines pressed deeply into the paper as if carved rather than written. There was no hesitation in the script. No doubt. The entries described sound not as sensation, but as instrument, as a force capable of reshaping the body through repetition. Sound was purification. Repetition was obedience. Silence was not absence, but confirmation. The journals documented sessions without naming those subjected to them. Individuals were reduced to variables, bodies described in terms of duration and response. There were notes on breathing patterns, on the point at which resistance gave way to alignment. The bell was referenced not as a symbol, but as a mechanism calibrated for endurance, its weight and resonance precisely suited to the limits of human attention. The space beneath the tower was designed to trap sound, to force it downward, inward, until there was no distinction between vibration and thought. The pastor had written extensively about the danger of unregulated sensation. He described screaming as excess, convulsions as misalignment, fear as wasted energy. The method was correction, not punishment. Those brought below were not meant to die. They were meant to remain until the sound no longer provoked reaction. Until the body learned to listen without response. Until silence emerged not as mercy, but as mastery. Marginal notes appeared more frequently toward the end of the journals. Observations grew more intense, more personal. The pastor wrote of refinement, of progress, of a town growing quieter not by chance, but by design. He expressed satisfaction with the bell's reliability, with its ability to impose rhythm even in his absence. There were passages describing the necessity of control, the burden of oversight, the loneliness of stewardship. He wrote of the risk inherent in delegation, of the importance of bearing the sound oneself to ensure accuracy. The final entries shifted tone. The pastor began documenting his own exposure. He described extended listening sessions conducted alone beneath the tower, calibrating himself to the rhythm he had imposed on others. He wrote of the bell's purity when heard without resistance, of the clarity that emerged when the body ceased to object. He noted changes in his perception of time, of thought slowing to match the interval between strikes. He recorded moments of perfect stillness, achieved not through effort, but surrender. The last page ended mid-sentence. Above ground, the town struggled to absorb the implications. The chamber was sealed again quickly, this time under official order, mortar laid thicker than before. The journals were removed, reviewed in fragments, then locked away. It was agreed that the material was unsuitable for circulation, that its existence would only provoke unrest. The bell tower was declared inactive. The rope was removed. The mechanism dismantled. The town insisted on closure. That night, the bell rang. There was no rope, no mechanism, no human presence. 13 strikes, unchanged, patient, exact. The sound traveled downward as much as outward, pressing into the ground, into the sealed chamber, into the space where restraints still waited. Those who had seen the journals recognized the rhythm immediately. It was not summoning. It was confirmation. The bell had never required a hand. The chamber had never required an audience. The pastor had not been the source, only the conduit. Whatever process had been refined beneath the tower had reached a point where supervision was no longer necessary. The sound continued because the conditions remained intact. The town was quieter. The bodies were compliant. The silence was complete. When the final strike faded, it left behind the same dense absence as always. But now, beneath that silence, there was understanding. The bell had not revealed the truth by accident. It had waited until the structure above it was ready to bear the knowledge. And it continued to ring not in defiance of exposure, but because exposure had been part of the design all along. The journals detailed the method without shame, without hesitation, without the distancing language of metaphor. They were manuals disguised as reflections, stripped of doubt and ornament, written by a man who believed he had discovered a principle older than doctrine. Each page pressed the same idea deeper. The body was an instrument that resisted order by instinct, and sound was the only force patient enough to correct it. Those deemed afflicted were brought beneath the tower after dusk, when the town had settled into its nightly quiet, and the air no longer carried distractions. The descent itself was part of the process. Narrow stairs forced the body forward, shoulders brushing stone, breath shortening as the ceiling lowered. Light diminished gradually, not extinguished all at once, teaching the eyes to adjust, teaching the mind to anticipate deprivation. By the time the chamber opened, the subject had already begun to listen. Chains were secured carefully, not with haste or anger, but with precision. The journals emphasized placement. Wrists at a height that discouraged collapse. Ankles positioned to prevent leverage. The body was suspended just enough to remain conscious, just enough to ensure that every vibration traveled unobstructed through bone and muscle. The pastor recorded that discomfort alone was insufficient. Pain created resistance. The goal was exposure. The bell was rung by hand at first. The journals described the physical act in detail. The weight of the rope, the controlled pull, the way the bell answered not immediately but after a brief delay, as if considering the request. Each strike was timed, spaced to match a measured interval that slowed the pulse rather than accelerated it. The sound filled the chamber unevenly, pressing against walls, folding back on itself, refusing to dissipate. There was no echo that offered relief, only accumulation. Subjects screamed in the beginning. The journals treated this not as failure, but as data. Screaming was excess sound produced by the body in protest, noise without structure. It was expected. The pastor noted how long it took for the screaming to falter, for breaths to grow irregular, for the voice to fracture under repetition. He wrote that the bell did not overpower the scream. It absorbed it, broke it apart, forced it to conform. Night after night, the sessions continued. There was no attempt to shorten them. Duration was critical. The bell rang until the subject's responses shifted. Some began to cry silently, mouths open, throats rigid, sound withheld by instinct rather than choice. Others convulsed until exhaustion imposed stillness. The journals marked these transitions carefully, noting the exact point at which resistance gave way to alignment. Alignment was not peace. It was synchronization. When the body learned to anticipate the next strike, when breath began to fall into the spaces between sound, when muscles tightened and released in rhythm rather than defiance, the screaming stopped. Silence followed, not because mercy had been granted, but because the lesson had been received. The bell continued regardless. Silence was not an end state. It was confirmation. The journals were clear on this point. The bell was never meant to summon God. It was not prayer, not warning, not celebration. It was a tool designed to grind resistance down into stillness, to teach flesh that endurance was holiness and submission was cure. Faith, as described by the pastor, was not belief but tolerance. Not hope, but the ability to remain present under repetition without deviation. He wrote of success in unemotional terms. Bodies that ceased reacting were recorded as stabilized. Those that did not were described as unresolved and kept longer. Death was acknowledged only as a logistical complication, never as failure. The bell did not kill, he insisted. The body relinquished itself when it refused instruction. Over time, the entries shifted focus from the subjects to the system itself. The pastor became increasingly interested in the bell's capacity to function independently of his presence. He observed that once the pattern was established, once the town had internalized the rhythm, the bell seemed to require less intervention. He wrote of nights when the sound felt inevitable, as though the act of ringing had already occurred before he touched the rope. The final section of the journals concerned solitude. The pastor described a growing concern that the method had never been tested without an external subject. Correction imposed on others was effective, but incomplete. To understand whether faith could survive its own sound, he needed to remove the variable of another body. The experiment would be conducted alone, beneath the tower, without audience or interruption. He framed this not as sacrifice, but as verification. Preparations were documented meticulously. The chamber was adjusted to accommodate a single occupant. Chains were repositioned. The bell's interval was recalculated to match his own measured breath. He wrote of the importance of equality, of submitting himself to the same conditions he had enforced to prove the sound was impartial. Authority, he believed, could only endure if it was willing to be consumed by its own principles. The entries grew sparse as the experiment began. Observations were shorter, fragmented by long pauses between lines. He described initial discomfort, then calm. He noted moments where the sound no longer arrived from above, but seemed to originate inside the body, vibrating outward rather than inward. Time became unreliable. Thought slowed. Language lost urgency. On the final pages, the pastor wrote of a clarity he had never known. The bell no longer demanded endurance. It no longer imposed rhythm. It revealed it. He described a state in which resistance was not overcome but rendered irrelevant, where the body no longer distinguished between sound and silence. Faith, in this condition, was not belief in something greater, but the absence of the need to escape. The last complete sentence ended with a description of listening that required no effort. After that, the writing stopped. Those who later reviewed the journals struggled to reconcile the precision of the method with the stillness it sought to produce. The town sealed the chamber again, thicker, deeper, convinced that containment equaled resolution. The journals were locked away, their contents deemed corrosive, unsuitable for repetition. But the bell did not forget. It continued to ring because the system had been completed. The pattern no longer required instruction. The town itself had learned the lesson. Bodies had adjusted. Noise had diminished. Resistance had been trained out of the collective through absence, through anticipation, through fear refined into routine. The pastor's solitude had not tested whether faith could survive its own sound. It had removed the final human restraint. The bell no longer needed to be rung. It had become the rhythm beneath the town's silence, grinding without motion, counting without hands, teaching endurance long after the one who designed it had finally learned to listen without response. When the chamber was sealed and the journals burned, the town declared itself cleansed, rational, modern. The act was framed as progress rather than erasure. Stone was laid carefully, thicker than before, mortar pressed into every seam until no trace of the entrance remained. Ash from the journals was scattered beyond the river, diluted into water and soil, rendered harmless by distance. Records were amended. Accounts simplified. What could not be explained was labeled excess and discarded. The bell tower was locked, its interior stripped of rope and mechanism, reduced to architecture without function. For a time, this was enough. The nights grew quieter, or perhaps the town simply learned to sleep more deeply. Children were born who never heard the bell rung by human hands. The square filled with ordinary sounds again: carts, prayers, livestock, weather. Visitors passed through without remark. The tower stood as it always had, tall and inert, its presence familiar enough to be ignored. The town spoke of the past only when required, and then briefly, as one might mention an illness already survived. Yet the bell continued to ring. It did not announce itself every night. It chose moments that felt deliberate in their restraint. Always after stillness had settled fully, after lamps were extinguished and bodies surrendered to rest. It rang 13 times, no more and no less. Each strike separated by the same measured pause. No rope moved. No mechanism responded. The sound arrived complete, patient, immune to intervention. Those who heard it did not rush to investigate. They lay still, listening, recognizing the pattern even if they refused to name it. What unsettled them most was not the persistence, but the timing. The bell rang on nights when no one was missing. No sickness preceded it. No confessions had been made. No rumors circulated. It rang when there was nothing left to correct. The sound no longer followed transgression. It existed independently of cause, as if the need for purification had been replaced by maintenance. Years passed. The tower fell out of use entirely. Repairs were postponed, then forgotten. Ivy crept along its base. Stone weathered unevenly. Eventually, access was restricted for safety, and then simply abandoned. The town expanded away from it, redirecting paths and attention elsewhere. The bell was discussed less and less, not because it had stopped, but because acknowledging it required remembering too much. Travelers began to report the sound long after the town stopped listening. Merchants resting on the outskirts spoke of hearing distant blows carried through fog, too slow to be wind, too regular to be chance. Pilgrims described nights interrupted by a bell that seemed to ring beneath their feet rather than above them. Some claimed the sound followed them for miles, fading only when dawn approached. These accounts were dismissed politely. Outsiders lacked context. They misunderstood acoustics. They brought expectations with them and shaped noise into meaning. But the descriptions grew more specific. The pauses between strikes, travelers said, felt different. No longer simply measured. They seemed anticipatory, waited. Some swore the rhythm matched something internal, something learned before language. A few placed a hand against their chest while listening and felt alignment, not perfectly synchronized, but close enough to unsettle. The bell no longer imposed rhythm. It mirrored it. Those who returned through the town noticed changes difficult to articulate. People moved more slowly. Speech was economical. Laughter, when it occurred, cut off abruptly, as if exceeding an unspoken threshold. Children learned quickly when to be quiet without being told. The town functioned efficiently, peacefully, with an absence of visible conflict that impressed visitors and disturbed those who stayed longer. No one spoke of the chamber anymore. The sealed stone beneath the tower was considered inert, irrelevant. Yet beneath it, the earth retained its memory. The restraints, though rusted, remained embedded. The shape of the space endured. Sound, once introduced into such a place, did not vanish. It settled. It layered itself into the stone, into the ground, into the bodies above it. The bell no longer needed to ring audibly to be present. Its influence had diffused. On certain nights, those lying awake felt the sensation before the sound arrived. A tightening in the chest, a slowing of breath, a pause that extended just long enough to suggest expectation. When the bell rang, it confirmed what the body already knew. The sound did not wake them. It synchronized them. The town never reconsidered its declaration of cleanliness. From the outside, it remained an example of order achieved through reason. Records showed no anomalies. There were no unexplained deaths, no disappearances, no public unrest. What had been burned was not knowledge, but responsibility. The bell, relieved of interpretation, continued without opposition. Long after the tower crumbled beyond repair, after stone collapsed inward and the bell fell into darkness, the sound persisted. Travelers passing through the empty square reported hearing it from below ground, muffled but precise. 13 strikes. Always 13. The pauses between them slow and even, like a breath held without strain. Some claimed the rhythm had changed, that it no longer counted time outward, but measured something inward instead, that it felt complete. No pastor stood to oversee it. No doctrine guided it. The sound no longer sought obedience or correction. It had outlived purpose and become condition. The bell did not ring to cleanse, to warn, or to summon. It rang because the system it created had reached equilibrium. The town had learned to listen without reacting. The bell had learned it no longer needed to be heard.